This is lecture number 43 in the series The ABCs of Communism. This time we're talking about the Empire Strikes Back against Brazil. And I've got a subtitle in the chapter 60, which will be the text for this particular lecture when this next edition comes out next year, 2017, called The Crashing Against the Rocks of South America. I just wanted to take a moment to say that the moment I have dreaded since the CIA successfully assassinated Hugo Chavez a few years ago has finally arrived. U.S. imperialism, our most lethal enemy, is on the charge again, this time against South America. And this time we may not be able to stop them until they have done considerable damage to South America. On the other hand, at the same time that that's going on, you want to keep in mind that the U.S. only has one strategy, and that's war and subversion. On the other hand, this morning, the Chilean and Chinese governments announced that they've opened an RMB clearing bank, which will allow Chile and any other South American country that wants to trade directly in their national currencies with the Chinese without going through U.S. dollars. And in the long run, that is going to have more effect than all of this U.S. CIA subversion put together. Well, at any rate, they have taken complete control, the gringo CIA has, of Mexico and Honduras, and they have been making a real strong push in Peru, and they have pretty well taken control there too. But on the other hand, they've been blocked in, of course, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, and they haven't been able to get anywhere there. So right now the thrust of their attack is on Brazil and Argentina and Paraguay. Well, it's Brazil that's the key here. Argentina, the masses are fighting back there pretty much on their own, as they are. Temer said this morning in Brazil that his government has so little legitimacy that 75% of the Brazilian people consider it to be an illegal coup government, and he's worried that something needs to be done about that. Well, his fourth one of his cabinet ministers has just been arrested on cocaine trafficking charges. So in the 30 days of this so-called government that the coup regime was established here with the help of the CIA, they have lost 4 ministers through corruption, and half of their ministry is already indicted under various corruption charges, including the president. At any rate, to understand how this mess got started, let's go back for a moment. We have reviewed the period of prehistoric communism in Brazil, the colonial period, and the modern era of capitalism versus anarchism and Bolshevism in Chapter 40, and in the accompanying lectures numbers 25A and 25B. Now we shall review the period of gringo-imposed fascism, the kind of their preferred type, in alliance with the most reactionary families in the Brazilian ruling class, which started in 1964. Some persons from these ruling classes I came to know personally, as I have recounted in Volume 3 of my autobiography, Shining Path, the Peruvian Revolution, in the autobiographical series Idaho Smith's Search for the Foundation, which is available in ebook form and in hard copy in some libraries, but it's probably easier to get in ebook form nowadays from Amazon Kindle books. At any rate, let's start then at the beginning of this modern period. In 1964, the Brazilian military conducted a coup. The military regime, calling themselves a revolution, installed a fascist dictatorship that lasted for 20 years. In this, the U.S. CIA assisted them at every turn, and as usual, the gringo-installed regime conducted horrifying and inhuman physical violence of the Hitlerian type against all those it considered subversives. Physical violence had always been used against petty criminals by the police. However, during this CIA-dominated period, none, no matter what his or her socioeconomic standing, escaped the horrors of power-wielding torturers. It was Operation Condor for Brazil. Now, we're beginning today to witness the beginning of Condor 2. It features the same bag of actors, namely the Gringo CIA and most reactionary native Brazilian ruling families. But we'll start out this lecture by going through Condor 1. Now, what led to the revolution military coup of 1964 was the defeat of U.S. imperialism in Cuba. The U.S. ruling oligarchy of billionaire families was determined to prevent communism from spreading throughout their previously uncontested, almost wholly owned Western Hemisphere. And they had begun with the George H.W. Bush masterminded assassination of JFK only a few months earlier. Now, for those of you who haven't seen it, let me recommend again that you go to YouTube and watch the 3.5-hour-long documentary movie called From JFK to 9/11. As a person who has watched this assassination case develop over the years, I can tell you that this guy has finally got it all together, at least as much as we could ever hope to see in my lifetime, so it's well worth your time. That's JFK to 9/11. Now, inside Brazil, there had been 2 civilian presidents before the 1964 military takeover. They were Brazilian Peronistas, similar to those we have called Mexican Peronistas of the same period. All these men had actively pursued nationalist policies to the detriment of multinational investment in Brazil. All would eventually succumb to the Gringo Colossus in the north. Now, the most dangerous had been President João Goulart, who had imposed restrictions on multinational investment and pursued a nationalist policy of supporting and subsidizing private national capital not associated with foreign capital. In other words, Goulart was the equivalent to Juan Perón in Argentina and López Mateos in Mexico. And we've already discussed these men and their periods extensively in previous lectures. Now, these nationalist policies and this emphasis on social programs were the progressive bourgeoisie's response to the rapid organization of the working class. And this organization of the workers by revolutionary communists was inspired by the Cuban Revolution, and it struck terror into the upper 0.1%. As we saw in the previous chapter and lectures on Brazil, these reactionaries had never before made even minimal concessions in Brazil regarding wages, working conditions, or trade union organization. They preferred chattel slavery and did not agree to dismantle it until the end of the 1800s. Thus, the military stepped in before it was too late. In so doing, they sacrificed Brazil's sovereignty to a system of imperial dependent capitalist development. Now, the fascist phases of the stage of capitalism can be divided, and I divide herein as follows. First, 1964, when the military coup took place. 2, 1965 to 68, during which time the apparatus of state repression was consolidated. In 1969 through 74, the period when repression and torture reached their height and Brazil experienced the so-called economic miracle, the same kind of economic miracle that capitalist ideologists used to ascribe to Hitlerian Germany. And 4, 1974 to 1985, the period of gradual liberalization and democratization, but of course always under military dictatorship. So let's go to the first phase, 1964, when the Army led the other military service branches, and its objective was first to secure power, and second to redirect the nation's economy to the oligarchs' political and economic benefit. The national private economic elite of 0.1% had a goal, and that was to prevent the nationalization of those sectors of the economy they already owned. Now, the U.S. oligarchy was the motivating force behind the coup, and they conceived it as an essential part of their Operation Condor 1, which we have described in previous lectures. Now, in the first days after the revolution, the military institutionalized the system it would need to maintain control. And it did it this way. The Army created a new constitution and declared that there would be subsequent institutional acts. That's the key phrase. the key term, institutional acts, of which there were going to be about 14. Now, the military high command said it would address resistance with new mechanisms of state power, meaning secret police, unrestricted in the use of power. And this is, of course, George Dimitrov's classical definition of fascism. Institutional Act Number 1 gave the new executive the power it needed to carry out economic, financial, political, and moral reconstruction of Brazil in the image of Hitler's Germany. In other words, in the image desired by gringo imperialism. In this stage, the military sought to prove to the U.S., rulers, of course, and international aid agencies that Brazil was once again committed to the neoliberal free world economy. To begin with, General Castelo Branco was the first of the military presidents. He finished out the term of the ousted civilian president. The new government made clear that it would maintain the terminology of a constitution, elections, and the National Congress. Of course, this was just a farce. The military quickly began to purge intellectuals and politicians who had been closely tied to the pre-1964 government, and others supposedly leading Brazil to communism. This purge was not just sending them to the street unemployed, they were sent to the prison and to the grave. State targets included the progressive members of the Catholic Church and its youth organizations, the leftist political parties, urban and rural labor organizations, and academics and political activists. Torture for information and confession was standard operating procedure. Opposition to the fascist regime grew during this time, and the government responded by wiping out, killing some 5,000 enemies of the regime right off the bat. Initial support for the coup included most of the media, the Catholic Church, the Federal Bar Association, the national economic elite, of course, and most importantly, the U.S. government. All right, Phase 2 started the following year in 1965 and goes through 1968. The regime instituted typical neoliberal austerity. The military took over the instruments of propaganda to present the image of a country under control. It gave technocrats the power to implant measures that would bring inflation under control and attract foreign investors and lenders. Before Congress was closed, members of the Arena Party, that's capital A-R-E-N-A, enjoyed the protection of the government and comfortable assignments. With the tight control the military exercised over the country, the regime implanted economic measures designed to cut real wages and boost the gains of national elites. Economic stabilization under these terms was the main goal. Now, after Congress was closed in December of 1968, the MDB, of the Brazilian Democratic Movement in English, an umbrella organization of bridging liberals to communists, was the only legal opposition party to Arena. Division within the MDB arose during this time as to whether the party should participate in the silly, phony, military-controlled elections. The issue was resolved when purges of professors and educational programs forced students to organize and fight back. The army and police saw these student protests as a threat and cracked down hard on demonstrations. Some students got smart and went underground before they were killed. Guerrilla war against the fascist regime then got underway, and Dilma Rousseff, the current legal president of Brazil, was one of those who went underground and fought back. As wages were cut, labor unions began to strike, and the government quickly enacted laws against striking and labor unions in general. The Catholic Church hierarchy supported the regime. When some priests defied their masters and supported the popular resistance, the police killed them, and the hierarchy gave tacit approval with its silence. This happened in all of the Latin American countries, you may remember. During the second phase, the fascist regime attempted to appear democratic, so phony direct elections were held. And then the Ineligibilities Act was passed by the military government. When I say passed, I mean they simply issued it. It barred candidates deemed opponents of the fascist revolution. In 1965, even this phony election result, however, resulted in 2 members of the opposition being elected to governorships of important states. When President Castelo Branco maintained that they could assume their elected offices, a coup within a coup developed, which threatened to depose him and consolidated the strengths of the harder-line military generals. As a compromise, Castelo Branco issued the Institutional Act No. 2, which abolished political parties except for Arena and the MDB and suspended the direct election of governors. In 1967, the second military president, General Artur da Costa y Silva, fell ill. This was a de facto assassination attempt and would have put the VP in office, but the harder-line generals, that they're called duristas in Portuguese, seized the opportunity to install one of their candidates and promptly enacted measures to give him a 5-year term. In 1968, Institutional Act No. 5 closed all the national and state congresses indefinitely, suspended all legal opposition, established rule by military decree only, and gave the president broad emergency powers. Official censorship was decreed that outlawed criticism of any institutional act or member of the armed forces. It prohibited news of workers or student movements. So the press was brought immediately under complete censorship and control. Opposition to military fascist dictatorship was no longer in doubt as a strategy, and university students protested in marches against the purges of professors and educational programs, and more priests of the Catholic Church began to speak out against injustice and torture and to shelter those blacklisted. In 1966, the fascist regime laid the foundation for the economic model, establishing Mussolini-style wage controls and providing all incentives for imperial capital investment. I'm saying you want to remember that an awful lot of these Brazilian fascists came from Italy. So the austere economic programs for workers and farmers earned praise and finally financial support from the U.S. and the U.S.-based aid agencies. Real wages were dramatically cut. Foreign investment, meaning U.S. corporations, were granted every concession, and the public sector was increasingly under attack. Fighting back, students and workers became more politically sophisticated and organizationally adept at survival. Various guerrilla groups were beginning to conduct attacks, which included strategic bombings, and among these guerrillas was the current president, Dilma Rousseff, who's now under threat by the coup going on. The period from 69 to 74 featured the Durista hardline generals with total power. They were determined to prevent the Castelistas, that is the previous president's name, any access to power. With executive protection, the government technocracy gained control over national development funds, reducing resources for the underdeveloped regions, and maximizing an open-door policy for foreign capitalists in these regions, regardless of effects on the inhabitants. Their greedy dreaming and belief in the apparent stability of the political system and the opportunities were attracting gringo imperialist investors. Protest in Gringolandia against the fascist regime in Brazil led to a short 5-month suspension of aid. Of course, this was just a phony sop to U.S. liberals by the equally fascist regime in the CIA and Pentagon, and aid resumed in mid-1969. Amnesty International denounced Brazilian torture in December '69 and was supported by other international organizations and foreign governments. And in August 1970, Brazil created a phony Human Rights Council, supposedly to hear alleged violations. And of course, this was another joke, and the military justice minister denied all charges that had been brought against the police and the army for all of the stuff they'd been doing. Right-wing death squads originating in the late 1950s, as we have discussed before. This was an essential part of the CIA's Operation Condor. They were active especially during this time to quiet the opposition. Progressive clergy were detained and tortured, as well as students and workers. Suppression of the guerrilla opposition was relentless and especially brutal. And among those captured and tortured was Dilma Rousseff. By this time, most Brazilian citizens were terrified of the repressive capabilities of the military torturers. In 1969, Emilio Garçasso Medici became the next military president. Press and electronic censorship was total, and the brutal state institutions of the police and army were in place. Gringo capitalist investors were attracted to the apparent stability of the political system and the opportunities of the economic system. Now, the armed struggle against fascism featured a civilian opposition terrorized into submission by the military torturers and the right-wing death squads. So the guerrilla insurgency, formed mainly of students who had gone underground, posed the only challenge to the government. Now, the guerrillas managed to kidnap international diplomats and negotiated the release of captured comrades, forcing their recognition of foreign governments. For greater impact, the guerrillas kidnapped diplomats from the countries that were most heavily investing in Brazil's economic growth at the time: the USA, Japan, West Germany, and Switzerland. These were defensive, not offensive actions, but by their nature they were spectacular. Only one person died at the hands of guerrillas, and that was an accident. The first kidnapping occurred in September '68 and set the precedent for future guerrilla acts. Demands were made in exchange for the release of the kidnapped diplomats, which included radio broadcasts of the guerrillas' manifesto and the release of specific political prisoners. And they got away with this because the first kidnapped was the Gringo ambassador to Brazil. And due to pressure from USA, the guerrillas' demands were met quickly and he was released. So, in that way, they managed to get their message out across all of the radio and television stations in the country. As these challenges to the military continued, institutional acts to the military's draft of the Constitution were issued in response to the guerrillas' success in getting comrades released. The government issued the Institutional Act No. 13, which gave the government power to permanently exile all political prisoners released as a result of negotiation with terrorists or any Brazilian deemed dangerous to national security, and in Institutional Act No. 14, which restored the formal death penalty, non-existent in peacetime Brazil since 1891, which was, of course, kind of irrelevant since the cops just kill anybody anytime they feel like it, kind of like they do up here. The National Security Law of 1969 allowed the fascist regime to exercise complete discretion in determining what may constitute a crime against national security. An amendment to the 1967 Constitution increased the power of the executive branch by issuing a decree law which enabled the executive to pass secret decree laws. As the guerrillas were successful in trading kidnapped diplomats for the release of political prisoners, the government became less willing to negotiate. Detention and torture were relentless and especially brutal. After the first kidnapping, the government arrested and tortured members of the underground movement. In 1971, the regime declared that the guerrilla groups had been largely liquidated, but this was a lie. They were in fact larger than ever and spreading across the country. In 1970, the regime declared Congress reopened, but the MDB boycotted congressional elections, giving fascist President General Medici overwhelming majority strength to promote further economic programs designed for development, quote unquote. One way Medici sought to recast his image was to begin construction of the Trans-Amazon Highway, which at that time was funded mainly by the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, a CIA front. And as a rule of thumb, anything that has the name Inter-American in front of it is a CIA front. Anyway, the Trans-Amazon Highway would open a path to the cheap, fertile land of the Amazon region as part of the policy for gringo imperial capitalists to find and use new resources. You know, that situation has changed quite a bit now that the Chinese have agreed with the Brazilian government to build a Trans-Amazon Railway, which of course will have a completely different outcome. And I'm not sure where that is at the moment, because nothing in Brazil is functioning at the moment, since the government doesn't have any money and doesn't seem to be able to find any. They can't even get any money into Rio for these Olympics. Medici wanted to avoid radicalized workers leaving the devastated Northeast for the industrial center South. In other words, if those workers that are all radicalized up by the mouth of the Amazon River in those cities, if they were to, they're getting out of there because the economy's collapsed. If they were to come to Sao Paulo, that would cause a real fucking problem, so to speak. So what they got the idea of getting them to go out into the Amazon, and this Trans-Amazon Highway was one way that they thought they would be able to encourage that. Medici wanted to avoid radicalized workers leaving the devastated Northeast, as I said, for the industrial center South, and he wanted to send them to settle and explore the Amazon regions where their energies would be absorbed in the struggle for survival. The Capitalistas, in the period from 74 to 85, and remember these are those that followed General Castelo Branco, who was the more progressive fascist. Capitalistas managed to gain the presidency under General Ernesto Beckman Geisel, who became president in 74. That's 10 years after the military coup. The final period of the military government served two purposes. One, to destroy the two underground parties, that is the Communist Party of Brazil, the PCB and the PCdoB. These were two different communist parties. And two, to destroy the human rights and grassroots movements forming in Sao Paulo, the economic center of the country. State terror was being used primarily against workers and small farmers, and many gringo caps withdrew their investments because of the world oil crisis, so Brazil plunged into debt. In 1974, such opposition as was allowed was via the Brazilian Bar Association, the Brazilian Press Association, and the National Conference of Brazilian Bishops. The student movements and labor organizations were restive, but under tight surveillance by the fascist regime. And the MDB forced the government to constantly change the rules governing electoral politics to favor arena, and resulted in a further weakening of the military's non-existent legitimacy. In 1976, the military limited MDB's access to radio and television, which were essential sources for campaign effectiveness, in an attempt to manipulate the elections in favor of the government. This forced the MDB to organize locally and boomeranged against the regime by strengthening MDB's ties to civil organization. Maria Alves says the disparity between the language and the practical need for repression had two important consequences. First, it forced the military government to seek legitimacy based on consensus established in formal institutions of political representation. The government had thus not been able to abolish such bodies as Congress, state and municipal assemblies, and political parties, although elections were always completely phony. They continued to be necessary to maintain the fiction of legitimacy. And second, this gap opened space for the opposition to maneuver, organize, and even negotiate with the system. The process of abertura, or opening, was a controlled process. Geisel's government party would continue to win elections. He made it very clear that the military was not to be pushed too fast, and the opening or abertura process, such as it was, got underway. The conflict between the military's internal factions began to heighten. So Geisel faced a confrontation with the military Deristas, the torturers, and the National Intelligence Service. These far-right controlled nutballs embarrassed the Geisel regime and created tension between the government and civil society. They did this by engaging in censorship and in the torture of prominent lawyers and journalists, as they had been doing all along to everyone else. In 1977, Geisel closed Congress briefly to control the presidential succession, as conflict erupted between his government and the Deristas, the Congress, the church, and the media. He managed to further pursue what the progressive fascists wanted, such as eliminating Institutional Act No. 5 and restoring habeas corpus. In 1979, General Figueiredo assumed office as the second to last of the military presidents. The army appointed his civilian successor, José Sarney, in 1985, and there was a limited amnesty for some political exiles and political prisoners, and an end to the two-party system. In 1984, a nationwide campaign demanded the reintroduction of direct election for the president and other officials. Accordingly, national support for opposition parties heightened, and in 1989, the country finally held direct elections for the office of president, electing Fernando Collor de Mello. The nature of Brazil's capitalist development was dictated by the policies of the military government as spelled out in the Doctrine of National Security and Development, quote unquote. This doctrine justified the imposition of a system of controls and wealthy elite class domination, declaring that it did not require the support of the masses to legitimize state power. The government slogan was security with development, and above all, it promised to eliminate the danger of subversion from communism and to punish those in the government who had become rich through corruption. It established legitimacy of rule by the biggest bourgeoisie and the international aid agencies, by which they mean USAID, IMF, and so on, and declared Brazil again committed to a free world economy. Labor unions were newly formed, a la Mussolini, but never succeeded in having many workers in their membership. Distribution of income under the new economic plan had become increasingly unequal. Ironically, in 1972, the World Bank president, the intellectual midget Robert McNamara, denounced Brazil for having neglected its poor people in its drive for growth. Obviously ironic, because the neoliberal economic policies of the U.S. imperialism that had been imposed on Brazil was the reason the nation was in crisis. Initially, for the bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie, there were high salaries for professionals and for those willing to reconcile themselves to living under under a dictatorship, so their economic rewards could be great. The economic gains helped generate some genuine middle-income support for the government and the 1970 congressional elections. Accordingly, the government party, Arena, won an overwhelming victory. What legitimacy the military government enjoyed, however, was directly tied to and depended on the continued success of the imperialist neoliberal economic policies for at least a few people. And of course, what passed for prosperity for these few could not last even for them because of the iron law of capitalist development. The vicious police state face of the dictatorship had been prepared and was now prepared to destroy the inevitable protest of the disenfranchised and unemployed, and by this time the resistance emerged and the mechanisms for police rule were in place and the military could quickly respond. Along the way, it was the U.S. CIA that trained the Brazilian state institutions to institute fascism in their preferred image. This was Operation Condor I in Brazil. The military knew of its legitimacy nationally and internationally depended entirely on the continuation of economic growth. The government and technocrats insisted on the argument that increase in the pie would eventually mean a larger slice for everyone. Now, this was obvious neoliberal nonsense. The lack of wealth distribution, or to put it another way, the increased inequality was a result of Karl Marx's iron law of capitalist development, and no amount of silly prognostication by neoliberal propagandists could change this motor of internal contradictions. This inevitable appearance of resistance and the need to suppress it led to the cycles of repression and liberalization which would characterize the military dictatorship period. At the beginning of each term, every military president initiated a policy of liberalization intended to ease tension created by the previous president's policy of violent repression and legislative controls. In conclusion, I quote in this book several people who have interesting comments to make. They were in the Amnesty International report, but I'm not going to go over this here. Brazilians have often remained neutral in the fights among their rulers. On the other hand, they are passionate about some things, and those are the things that affect their private lives. Strikes have occurred in all productive sectors. This volatile environment featured the reality that most Brazilians alive by the end of the dictatorship period were politically socialized under a military dictatorship. Their creativity served them well, however, as they learned to maneuver around the fascist government. After the formal end of the military power in 1985, the Brazilian people enjoyed two nationwide political victories. The first was the fight to regain their political rights in 1988, and the second was the impeachment of then President Collor in 1992 under charges of corruption. As we continuously see, however, even the most democratic of capitalist governments are in reality countless bourgeois dictatorships everywhere in the world. What a government will stand up for is increasingly relative and opportunistic. Economics and capitalist means of exchange always take precedence over human relations in such nations, and the system offered the elite of Brazil prosperity at the expense of the masses. However, as the Iron Law set in, many of those who had gained lost out. Then they were cast downward to suffer the same misfortune as the masses. This is the origin of these social democrat politicians like Victor Raúl de la Torre in Peru, which we've talked about many times. These are people that came from who were bourgeois but were not big enough to survive against their competitors, and they eventually lost their land and everything else. Conflict in Brazil during the military dictatorship lasted formally from 1964 until 1985. It was not a negotiable situation. It was a power struggle in which one side had the power and was willing to exercise extreme coercive force to maintain that power, and the other side simply had to survive. The military had been effective at initially catching the people off guard, swiftly establishing fascist state power, and subsequently using various dog and pony shows to keep the masses confused. Marginalization and oppression existed in Brazil before 1964. It continued under the military regimes, and for that matter continued to exist under the democratic government of Lula and Rousseff. However, the latter made progress for the masses real, and because state power continued in the hands of the bourgeoisie, however, they were never dispossessed in Leninist Cuba, the issue was never resolved, and it's not resolved to this day. Street children were used by the criminal gangs and then assassinated. Petty criminals faced daily police brutality. Squatters faced fighting for their rights, continued to struggle against landowners, backed by police forces. Today, opposition continues to grow, the sense of empowerment gained through big and small victories, and there is a growing consciousness that only a Cuban solution will work for the masses of working Brazilians. The industrial worker struggle and the landless movement in Brazil are becoming ever more organized and conscious of the power they can exercise and of their obligations to act, and since the Teamer coup of a month or so ago, they have no choice. The Brazilian people face incredible obstacles to the fact that their enemies have great resources with political influence, corrupt judges, and a totally corrupt police force. Capitalism is a system that reduces human relations to a system of competition and perpetuates the growing gap between the haves and have-nots, and it is a system based on unequal advantage in class war, a system in which the strong will continue to dominate because the caps have state power, that is the army and police, in their hands. Proletarian revolution puts the strength of the state in the hands of those now weak, and that's what is necessary. Now mass uprisings nationwide in Brazil show this more clearly than ever, that it's being seen as the only way to go by Brazilian masses. The advanced state of putrefaction plaguing the entire Brazilian system as one of the global South's leading nations is what we are witnessing right now in Brazil. I wanted to mention one other thing. There are various ways of getting information about Brazil. About the only good English writer on this subject, in my opinion, is Pepe Escobar. He's been writing a series of articles on Brazil, and in the end of this chapter I'm going to quote his most recent one in its entirety. But the other way of getting information about Brazil for a person such as myself, is to go there. Now, if you go there through the regular route of flying into Rio or Sao Paulo or even Manaus, for example, by an international carrier, well, then you're immediately being followed by their secret police and ours. There are other ways, however, of getting into Latin American countries, but in the case of Brazil, there's a really good one. If a person were to fly to the international airport in Leticia, Colombia, from some relatively neutral airport, say in Mexico or anywhere except for Gringolandia, then at night the border between Brazil and Colombia is closed. But there's actually just one town there, but there are two towns pushed together. It's Leticia, Colombia, Tabatinga, Brazil. Now, if you want to get into Brazil unnoticed, you can take a chance and just walk in. Now, for a gringo like me, it's not probably a good idea because gringos tend to stand out like a green thumb down there. But I could probably get away with just walking across the border because the border guards go home at night. At 5 o'clock, they're gone. So this place, the street, however, the Avenue of the Americas, is a big avenue. Goes back. People go back and forth all night. A faster way might be to give some kid $20 to ride on the back of his motor scooter, especially if it's a girl. Ride on the back of the motor scooter from Colombia into Brazil. Now, once you get there, you can go to the airport, the Tabatinga International Airport, and fly to Manaus. Once you get to Manaus, you know, all of these flights are inside the country. You shouldn't have any trouble traveling. Of course, I would advise that you use a passport that's not one that's being followed by the CIA. Anyhow, let's say you get in there. Now, you want to go to the places that are of most interest to you. These are the places where you'd anticipate there's going to be the most resistance, for example, today, to the Coup government. Sure, you want to take a look at the area you cross through, and Manaus, because these are important areas, but you'd want to get up into the northeast as quickly as possible, then into Rio, and then to Sao Paulo, and you know, you check into a hotel that middle-class Brazilians might stay in, and with some kind of, in every Latin American country, the secret police check the hotel registers every morning. So if you're a foreigner, you're going to have to show them a passport. Now, you don't want to show a gringo passport to somewhere down there. So you want to come along with other papers. If you don't have them, there are people on the street that can get them for you for a reasonable amount of money. Use this kind of an ID, change your name, of course, and you can move around this country, as long as you don't cause any trouble, you can move around this country without any difficulty at all. So these are ways that you can go and pick up information on your own if you're serious about it, without going through the formalities of that will immediately put you on the watch list of the CIA, FBI, the local narcotic cops, and probably about 20 other agencies. All right, now, in this lecture I want to go on to a short section on Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, and then to Dilma Rousseff, and we'll finish up with an analysis of this coup government. Lula da Silva was born on the 27th of October in 1945 in Caetés, which was then a district of Guarulhos, located 155 miles from Recife, the capital of Pernambuco, a Brazilian state in the northeast of Brazil. He was the seventh of 8 children of Aristides Inácio da Silva and Eurídice Ferreiro de Melo. 2 weeks after Lula's birth, his father moved to Santos with Valdomira Ferreira de Goes, a cousin of Eurídice. Now, usually known simply as Lula, he became a Brazilian politician, serving as president of Brazil from January 1st, 2003 to January 2011. He is the founding member of the Workers' Party. That's in Portuguese, that's the Partido dos Trabalhadores, and ran for president 3 times, which is why the Workers' Party is called PT. Ran for president 3 times unsuccessfully until the next time he won. His first campaign was the 1989 election, his second and third campaigns of the 94 and 98 elections, and then in 2002 election, his fourth run, he won, and he was inaugurated as President of Brazil on the 1st of January 2003. In the 2006 election, he was elected for a second term as president, and this ended on January 1st, 2011. He was succeeded in the presidency by his former chief of staff, Dilma Rousseff, who we have already mentioned several times, as a girl who had fought in the guerrilla underground, eventually been captured. He remains the most revered person in Brazilian politics. Accordingly, he is one of the most popular politicians in the history of Brazil and one of the most popular in the world. His social programs include the famous Bolsa Familia and Fome Zero, are hallmarks of that time in office, and among other things, these provide regular paychecks to every citizen, regardless of age, on a weekly to monthly basis, as Social Security does for elderly persons in Gringolandia. So these alone lifted tens of millions of people out of poverty and earned him the undying enmity of the neo-slavocrat Brazilian ruling oligarchy. Lula played a prominent role in international relations, including helping create a solution to the problem of the nuclear program of Iran and the fight against global warming. He advocated altering the balance of power among nations. Even the international cap press was impressed with his brand of Marxist reformism. For example, he was featured in Time's The Most 100 Influential People in the World in 2010. The cap press often called him the most successful politician of his time. In October 2011, Lula, who was a smoker for 40 years, was diagnosed with throat cancer. He gained a great deal of public sympathy and support when he started chemotherapy, and admiration when the cancer was forced into remission. During his childhood, in December '52, when Lula was only 7 years old, his mother decided to move to Sao Paulo with her children to rejoin her husband. After a journey of 13 days in a truck with an open bed, the family arrived in Guarulhos and discovered that Aristides had formed a second family with Valdomira. Aristides' two families lived in the same house for some time. 4 years later, Eurydice moved with her children to a small room in the back area of a bar in the city of Sao Paulo. After that, Lula rarely saw his father, who became an alcoholic and died in 1978. On his own, Lula was married 3 times. In 1969, he married Maria de Lourdes, who died of hepatitis in '71 when she was pregnant with their first son, who also died. Lula and his common-law wife, Miriam Cordero, had a daughter, Luren, in 1974, and in 1974, Luren married Marisa, his current wife, who was already a widow and with whom he had 3 sons, and he adopted Marisa's son from her first marriage. With regard to his education and his work history, Lula had little formal education. He did not learn to read until he was 10 years old and quit school after the 2nd grade in order to work to help his family. His working life began at the age of 12 as a shoe shiner and a street vendor. By age of 14, he got his first formal job in a copper processing factory as a lathe operator, and this was the beginning of his union education. Here he gained his first knowledge of Karl Marx and the iron law of capitalist development, becoming involved in union activities and educational programs. At age of 19, he lost the little finger on his left hand in an accident while working as a press operator at an automobile parts factory. After losing his finger, he had to run to several hospitals before he received medical attention. This experience increased his dedication to the workers' union, where he was recognized for his service and elected to several important union posts. His experience with the fascist state of the Brazilian military government perfected his understanding of the class struggle. Now, as for his union career, he was inspired by his brother, Frei Chico. Lula joined the labor movement when he worked at Indústrias Vilares. He rose steadily in the ranks and was elected in 1975 and re-elected in 1978 as president of the Steel Workers Union of São Bernardo do Campo and Diadema. Both cities are located in the ABCD region, home to most of Brazil's automobile manufacturing facilities, where such companies as Ford, Volkswagen, Toyota, Mercedes-Benz, and others are located, and is among the most industrialized part of the country. In the late 1970s, when Brazil was under military rule, Lula helped organize union activities, including major strikes. Labor courts found the strikes to be illegal, of course, and Lula was jailed for a month. Due to this, and like other people in prison for political activities under the military government, Lula was awarded a lifetime pension after the military regime fell. In regard to his political career, on the 10th of February 1980, a group of academics, intellectuals, and union leaders, including Lula, founded the Partido dos Trabalhadores, PT, or Workers' Party, a Marxist party with progressive ideas created in the midst of Brazil's military government. At this time, the communists were underground, but their leaders supported the concept of the PT and did what they could to put into play. In 1982, he added the nickname Lula to his legal name. In 1983, he helped found the Central Única dos Trabalhadores, CUT, the Central Workers Union. In 1984, PT and Lula joined the popular Direitos Já, that is Direct Elections Now campaign, demanding a direct popular vote for the next in the next Brazilian election. During the 1967 Constitution, Brazil presidents were elected at that time by both houses of Congress in joint session, with representatives of all state legislatures, but this was merely a sham. And as we've seen, the March '64 coup, each elected president had been a retired general chosen in a closed military caucus. Lula and the PT supported the public demand for a change in this so-called electoral system. That campaign was defeated by a vote in the Cap Congress. In 1985, a civilian president, Tancredo Neves, was appointed as usual. Only 4 years later, as a direct result of the Direitos Já, and after years of popular struggle, the 1989 elections were held, and for the first time it was possible to elect a president by direct popular vote in the last 29 years. In 1989, as a congressman, Lula ran as the PT candidate in the first democratic elections for president since 1960. Lula and Leonel Brizola, two popular left-wing candidates, were expected to vie for first place. Lula was viewed as the more left-leaning of the two, advocating immediate land reform and default on the external debt. However, a minor candidate, Fernando Collor de Mello, former governor of Alagoas, quickly amassed support among the nation's elite with a more business-friendly agenda, so Collor became popular, taking emphatic anti-corruption positions and eventually beat Lula in the second round of the '89 elections. In '92, Collor resigned under threat of impeachment for his alleged embezzlement of public money, which seems to be the most popular pastime in the country. Lula refused to run for re-election as a congressman in 1990, busying himself with expanding the Workers' Party organizations around the country, as the political scene in the 1990s came under the sway of the Brazilian real, monetary stabilization plan, that was the name of the currency, the real, which ended decades of rampant inflation. Former Minister of Finance Fernando Henriques Cardoso of the Brazilian Social Democracy Party, PSDB, defeated Lula in 1994 and again by an even wider margin in '98. But then, Lula won the presidency in 2002. He had been a strident union organizer, and however, he abandoned his platform plank of linking the payment of Brazil's foreign debt to a prior thorough audit. This last point had worried economists, businessmen, and banks, who feared that even a partial Brazilian default, along with the existing Argentine default, would have massive ripple effects through the world economy. So Lula became president after winning the second round of the 2002 election held on the 27th of October, defeating the PSDB candidate José Serra. Some of these names you're going to see around now because the PDSB is the party that was in a government coalition with Dilma Rousseff and that had all of its leaders indicted for corruption and suddenly decided that the best thing they could do is to get rid of her. Lula served 2 terms as president and left office on January 1st, 2011. During his farewell speech, he said he felt an additional burden to prove that he could handle the presidency despite his humble beginnings. If I failed, it would be the working class which would be failing. It would be this country's poor who would be proving they did not have what it takes to rule. This is how he looked at the importance of his candidacy anyway. Since the beginning of his political career to the present, Lula has changed some of his original ideas and modernized his positions. Instead of the drastic social changes he proposed in the past, his government chose a reformist line, passing a new retirement, tax, labor, and judicial legislation and discussing university reform. Some factions of the Workers' Party have disagreed with the increasing moderation and focus since the late 80s and have left the party to form distant wings such as the Workers' Cause Party, the United Socialist Workers' Party, and the Socialism and Liberty Party. In an interview published 26th of August 2007, he said that he had no intention to seek a constitutional change so that he could run for a 3rd consecutive term. His objective to reach the end of his term in a strong position in order to influence the succession. Lula put social programs at the top of his social agenda during the campaign and since being elected. Lula's leading program since very early on has been a campaign to eradicate hunger via the new Fome Zero, or Zero Hunger. This program, in addition to ending hunger, created water cisterns in Brazil's semi-arid region of Sertão, launched a campaign to counter teenage pregnancy, strengthen family agriculture, distribute a minimum amount of cash to the poor on a regular basis. There's nothing like sending a check every week to your supporters. Brazil's largest assisted program is Bolsa Familia, or Family Allowance, which is an expansion based upon the previous Bolsa Escola, the school allowance, which was conditioned on school attendance. So, in addition to getting your zero hunger check, many families could get a family allowance, and if they had kids going to school and could prove it, of course you had to go through various certifications that the kid was in school, you could get another check for the school allowance. So all of a sudden you've got people that had nothing are getting a regular income and are becoming pillars of the community. First introduced to the city of Campinas. Not long thereafter, other municipalities and states adopted similar programs, and in 2003 Lula formed Bolsa Familia by combining Bolsa Escola with additional allowances for food and kitchen gas. A new ministry, the Ministry of Social Development and Eradication of Hunger, affected this. In Brazil, as in most of Latin America, a great deal of cooking is done on propane stoves. Along with projects such as Fome Zero and Bolsa Familia, the Lula administration flagship program is the Growth Acceleration Program, or PAC, which had a total budget of 646 billion reals, or $353 billion in 2010. It strengthened Brazil's infrastructure, stimulated the private sector, and created more jobs. The social and urban infrastructure section received just $46 billion equivalent in reals. As Lula gained strength in the run-up to the 2002 elections, cat press propaganda scared the bourgeoisie that Lula would be another Hugo Chavez. Increased internal market speculation created a drop in the value of the real and a downgrade of Brazil's credit rating. However, in the beginning of his first term, Lula's chosen finance minister was Antonio Pelosi. Pelosi was a physician and a former Trotskyist activist. While serving as the mayor of Sugarcane Processing Industry Center of Ribeirão Preto in the state of Sao Paulo, he abandoned Trotskyism and joined Lula. Lula also chose Henrique Marques of the Brazilian Social Democracy Party, a prominent market-oriented economist, as head of the Brazilian Central Bank. As a former CEO of the Bank of Boston, he was acceptable Morales was elected to the Chamber of Deputies in 2002 as a member of the PDSB, resigning as deputy to become governor of the central bank. Lula renewed all agreements with the International Monetary Fund, while Argentina defaulted on its own deals in 2001. His government achieved a satisfactory primary budget surplus in the first 2 years, as required by the IMF agreement, exceeding the target for the third year. In late 2005, the government paid off its debt to the IMF in full, 2 years ahead of schedule. 3 years after the election, Lula had slowly but surely gained the confidence of the capitalist class, and sovereign risk indexes fell to around 250 points. The government's inflation targeting kept the economy stable and was accepted by the international cap ruling class during the 2005 World Economic Forum in Davos. In early 2006, Pelosi had to resign as finance minister due to his involvement in an abuse of power scandal, and Lula then appointed Guido Mantega, a member of the PT and an economist by profession, as finance minister. Mantega is a Marxist who had written a PhD thesis in sociology on the history of economic ideas in Brazil. He was critical of high interest rates that satisfy bankers, but not the people. Mantega has been supportive of higher employment by the government. Not long after the start of his second term, Lula announced the new Growth Acceleration Program, the new PAC. PAC solved many of the problems straitjacketing the economy, and the measures included investment in the creation and repair of roads and railways, simplification and reduction of taxation, and modernization of the country's energy production to avoid further shortages. The money in this program was around 500 billion reals, or that's more than 250 billion US dollars, over 4 years. Lula created public-private partnership concessions for 7 federal roadways. After decades as the largest foreign debtor among emerging economies, Brazil became a net creditor for the first time in January 2008. By mid-2008, 6 months later, both Fitch Ratings and the S&P had elevated the classification of Brazilian debt from speculative to investment grade, and banks have had record profits in under Lula's government. Lula, by his second term, was the undisputed master of popular affection as the first president to bring modest well-being to so many of his people and in complete control of his own administration. His 2 leading ministers were gone. Pelosi was no longer required to calm the nerves of overseas investors. Dear Sue, a virtuoso of cold political calculation and intrigue he had never liked and somewhat feared, so their joint elimination fired for him the sole command in Brasilia. When midway through his second term, its test came and he handled it with aplomb. The crash of Wall Street in 2008 might be a tsunami in the U.S. and Europe, he declared, but in Brazil it would be no more than a little ripple. In 2008, Brazil enjoyed the economic good health to fight the global financial crisis with large stimulus packages, and the administration's economic policies significantly raised living standards, with percentages of Brazilians belonging to the middle income sector rising from 37% to 50% of the population. Well, I then go through a section on Brazil's foreign relations under Lula, but I'm going to stop there because this lecture's already got to be rather long. I'm going to pick this subject up again when we talk about Dilma Ivana Rousseff, the president, legal president of Brazil at the moment. And we'll do that in a part 2 lecture on Brazil, and then we'll, after we get done with her, we will conclude with taking a close look at the nature of the coup regime and what's going on there, and relying heavily on the instruction of Pepe Escobar. So I'll stop there for today.